Now we're going to be looking at a group of teenage boys that not only served God, but they stood up to a wicked king. Now you got to understand, back in those days, if you looked at the king wrong, he'd have you killed. Now, how would you like to be faced with the possibility of being killed if you don't go along with the flow? Now, here we see a narcissistic, self-absorbed, wicked king that fully expects the entire known world that he is ruling at the time to do everything he says, and that nobody had dare better stand up against him. And we're going to see what happened to them. Now, first of all, in Daniel, at the end of Daniel chapter 2, these teenage boys were so remarkable, so sharp, that the king actually allowed them to help rule over the province of Babylon. And he elevated Daniel, the fourth one, to be on the council, the king's council. And they were captives from another country. Now, here you got to remember, if you were here last week, their names were taken away from them when they were taken from Israel to Babylon. They changed their names. Their original names was Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and Daniel. And they changed their names to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and Belteshazzar. All saying like God, they belong to this God, or they belong to that God. Took their dignity away from them, took their freedom away from them, and all of that. And so you would think that the average young person, or even old person, being that far from home, no family, no friends, except they were in Babylon together, that they would go along with whatever was happening in the country just so people would leave them alone. We are tempted with that today. If you want, Dr. Lakin used to say, if you want the devil to leave you alone, have nothing, do nothing, and be nothing. And he won't bother you. You can just float right along with a pointless life. But once you make a stand, buddy, the war is on. Now let's watch this. In Daniel chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar, that's the name of the king. Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold. This man loved himself. He thought he was it. And it's the image of gold, it said, was 60 cubits high, and the breadth was 6 cubits. A gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. It would not fit in here. Only half of it would fit in here. Not even half. That's probably not even 30 feet. And he set it up out in the middle of a plain where everybody could look at this thing. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. And now he's going to put the pressure on all of the people in his kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar the king sent to gather together. And for some reason, Daniel felt it necessary to include all of these people in the list. He sent to gather together the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Always remember, those that want to force you to comply are never the good guys. I don't care what government it is. We're seeing a little of that here in this country. Now, he summons all of these rulers, these people that were under him, and enlisted again. Then the princes, the governors, the captains, the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that he had set up. Then a herald, a person who makes the announcements, he cried aloud Unto you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages. I want you to understand, he had a huge empire. He had several nations and people underneath his rule. He was the ruler of the known world at the time. And it said, it's commanded to you that at what time you hear the sound. And he lists the different instruments that were in use at the time back then. He said, if you hear the sound of the cornet, the flute, the harp, the sackbut, the psaltery, the dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Kind of reminds me of the Grammys this year. Anybody see that? They were bowing to Satan and all that at the Grammys. They don't hide it anymore, people. That's not even hidden anymore. They just right out in the open. The devil doesn't hide. He doesn't try to act like he doesn't exist. He says, here I am, come and bow, and people will come and bow. Last night in Bedford County, the Temple of Satan rented a high school and had movie night. And they sold over 125 tickets. And it was a normal movie, but afterwards the followers of the Temple of Satan had a question and answer period where they were introducing the people that came to the Temple of Satan. You don't hide it anymore. And they will lie. They say, well, most of us are atheists. Now, if you're an atheist, you don't even believe in Satan. And one of their worship rituals, and they will tell you that, is abortion. And 125 people showed up to that. And they're going to try to have an after-school club in the local schools, the Temple of Satan, pretty soon. So, a lot of people, particularly young people, are going to be forced with a decision one day of what you're going to do about it. What are you going to do about it? When it comes to your school, are you going to stand up or are you going to go along with it? That's why I believe the revivals are coming through the young people right now. Because God is looking to the young people to make the stand and usher the Lord into this nation again where he belongs. So listen carefully. He said, when you hear all that music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. Then here's the alternative. And whosoever doesn't fall down and worship shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Some archaeologists drew a picture and set up a mock model of what this thing looks like. And it was a large square, like a box. It was huge. And it had a place to where you throwed people off the top wall down into this terribly hot burning fire. And the king had a window down at the bottom and some chairs for him and his cohorts to sit and watch people burn alive. That was the king. That's how wicked the king was. That's his entertainment. And that's what would happen to anyone that did not bow down to that golden image when they heard that music. Now, therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. That is no big deal to get people to do that nowadays. All the government has to do, all the media, whatever, make some kind of proclamation that this is what you will do, you will comply. And they don't even have to threaten you with death. They can threaten you with a fine. And everybody will bow. Just about. We went through that test during the pandemic. Or was that a dim panic? I'm not really sure what you call that. One of both. They tried to lock the churches down. They were successful with those who were compliant. And they told people they'd have to do this, they'd have to do that, and people were so terrified they did it. They were threatened with losing their business licenses or getting fined. They threatened the public that you're going to die if you do this. If you don't go by what we tell you to do, you'll die. And on and on and on. Fear is a powerful thing, folks. You get somebody scared of their life and they'll do just about anything. But not everybody. These young people did not worry about their life. They were not afraid of what the king could do to them because they served the king. And when you are a child of the king, it doesn't matter what happens to you. You will always be in his hands. Now, when everybody was bowing when they heard that music. But also at that time, in verse 8, certain of the Chaldeans came near. They were the Chaldeans, Hebrew for Karen. Let's put it in the modern translation here. Certain Karens came near and accused the Jews. I'll never forget, there was a fast food restaurant in Nelson County. It'd been there for 60 years. And when the pandemic came out, there were Karens running and peeping in the back window to see if the person cooking in the back was wearing a mask. And when they found out he wasn't, they complained and they complained. And finally the owner said, fine, and just closed the place forever. And there are people that, and I don't mean to get too much into that, but what I'm trying to tell y'all is there are people watching each and every one of y'all. And if you dare claim the name of Jesus in your life, they're going to watch you like a hawk. They're going to try to trip you up. They're going to try to find something to accuse you of, to destroy your testimony and make you of none effect of those around you. Always remember they will do that. That's why I tell people, tell the truth about me. That's a whole lot more fun than making up a lie. But seriously, they will watch you and they will do whatever they can to stop you if you're serving God. Make no mistake about it. You're going in some storms. You're going to walk through some fires if you dare to serve God. You will. There will be struggles. And I don't care how close you walk with the Lord. It's usually true, the closer you walk, the hotter the fire. Not going to sugarcoat that. I'm not going to be one of those to tell you if you accept Christ and you start serving him that everything is going to be fine. Because I'm looking in the face of a lot of people that have literally been through hell since you decided to serve God. I mean, all kinds of things have happened and tragedies. A lot of y'all are hurting this morning because of things that have gone on in your life. But you know what? Thank God you're still here. Y'all are sitting in here. You can give yourself a hand if you want to. It'll be all right. It's going to be tough, but you got somebody to walk with you. Now, these Karens, they spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever." That's always the way to butter up the king before you give him the bad news. "Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man that shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music shall fall down and worship the golden image, and whosoever falleth not down and worship, that he should be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." They are bringing the law back to the king. They're rehearsing the law that he just signed. They want to make sure that they hold him to it. And listen to this. There are certain Jews that you've set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, and their names is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these men, O king, have not regarded you. They haven't listened to what you had to say. They don't serve your gods, and they don't worship the golden image which you have set up. They knew how to rile him up. The king was so in love with himself that one day he planned to die in his own arms. And that's the way he was. He thought he was it. He thought he was God. He thought he was the law. He actually thought he was more powerful than God. He really did. He's getting ready to be taught a lesson by teenage boys. Now, then Nebuchadnezzar, here we go, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Now, you would think these teenage boys now, or young guys, are going to be brought before the king. Any disobedience to him is an instant death sentence. There's no lawyer. There's no appeal. There's no governor calling in at the last minute. You're going to die. You cross that king. That's bottom line. And they hauled them in, and you think they would be shaking in their boots. Nebuchadnezzar spoke and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not you serve my gods nor worship the golden image which I have set up?" Now he's trying to save face because he's mad, he's in a rage, and he's embarrassed that 3 teenage boys would dare to disobey him. You know, the big shot king of the universe or whatever. So he's going to remind them of the law. He said, "Now, if you be ready at what's time, you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made, then that's fine." He said, "Well." Then he gets arrogant. And these boys are going to put him in his place. He said, "But if you worship not, you will be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace." And here's the question that the devil whispers in everybody's ear from time to time. He said, "And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands?" What a arrogant dog. Who is that God that shall deliver? You know, you hear it all the time when you're going through a situation that God ain't going to deliver you. That God is not going to take care of you. God is not going to watch over you. And who is that God that can deliver you out of my hands? And some of you right now are in a situation that it don't look like nobody can come to your rescue. The doctor has told you something, maybe the bank has told you something, or somebody else has said something that has just pretty much devastated you, and the devil is whispering to you, "Who is that God that can deliver you out of my hands now? Look at you. Look at what you're going through. Look at what has happened in your life. Who is God now? Where's your God at now?" You'll hear that once you make a stand. And he thought that that would be all he needed to say. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful to answer you in this matter. We're not scared of you. Who are you? You're just a person. It don't matter if you are king of Babylon. You can't do anything unless God lets you do it." I remember back in the 80s, I walked up into a cell block at a jail with 8 men in it. I was not armed. Even though I was a deputy sheriff, you couldn't wear a gun in the cell block. And I had to go in there to fix something that had broke. And a man who was convicted of capital murder, who had nothing to lose, walked up to me and got in my face. And he said, "You know, we could kill you if we wanted to in here." And he went that far from my nose. And I said, "You know what? You couldn't do a thing unless God lets you do it." And he backed away. Thank God. But he did. He backed away from me, and it got quiet in there because at least there was enough respect for God to know that that was what I told them was true, and they believed it. And so they said, we're not careful, or we don't have any need to answer you. They told the king this: if it be so, our God who we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. You'd have to walk in that kind of confidence when you are faced with what you are being faced with right now. Don't buckle under, don't run, don't tuck your tail. You stand up in the face of that opposition and say, my God is able. He is able. And then they made this statement: but even if he won't deliver us, even if not, let it be known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. Even if God chose to take us home, I would rather go home to him with a clear conscience than to live longer in shame, knowing I have disobeyed God. They weren't afraid at all. They were not concerned over their life. They still had all of these years ahead of them, but they knew that they could die at any minute, and they were trusting God to deliver them. But they said, if God chose not to deliver us, we are still not going to sin, and we're still not going to serve your gods. Then was Nebuchadnezzar, oh, you know he was hot, full of fury. And listen to the way the Old English wrote. And the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know what that means in modern language? The color went out of his face. He was embarrassed in front of his lords and counselors when 3 teenage boys said, we're not going to bow. We're not going to do it. We don't care what you do to us. We are not going to serve your gods. Therefore he spoke and commanded. He was so mad that they should heat the furnace 7 times more than it was supposed to be heated. That's God's number of perfection. Now, I can imagine how horrible a burning fiery furnace was, but one heated up 7 times more than it was supposed to be heated. That's how angry he was. That's how full of rage, demonic rage, that he was full of. And then he, on top of that, he had to command, verse 20, the most mighty men that were in his army to tie up or bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. And these men were bound up. They put everything back on them. Now, you get thrown in a fire, you're going to, like that, you're going to burn up and die. But to make sure they burned up really good, it said they put their coats on them, their hosen, their hats, even got thrown in with their hats on, and their other garments to make a better fire. And they were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. You got to remember now that square box that he had made and the ladder that was going up there, and they threw them down in there. And while he's sitting in his chair watching through the window with his lords and counselors, and he watches them being thrown down into the fire. Now, because the king's commandment was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed the men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The mightiest men in his army burned to death, standing at the top of the furnace to throw the men over. It killed them. And because they knew if they disobeyed the king, they were going to get thrown in there anyway, so they took their chances and they burned up at the top of that furnace. It killed them. And then these 3 men, or these 3 teenagers, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell down bound. They were tied up. They tied their legs and their hands together. They fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So Nebuchadnezzar settles down to watch the show. Here he's going to have the pleasure of watching the people that stood against him and refused to go along with his wickedness. He was going to watch them roast. But it didn't happen that way. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and he rose up in haste. He got up out of his chair and went over and looked in that window. And he spoke and said to his counselors, "Didn't we cast 3 men tied up into the midst of the fire?" And they said unto the king, "True, O king, but here is what he saw." He answered and said, "Lo, I see 4 men, and they're loose, and they're walking in the midst of the fire." Go figure that out. They're not laying on the fire. They're walking up and down through the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Let him smoke that in his pipe. Here he looked in that window and he jumped up out of his chair and he asked his people, "Didn't we throw 3 in there?" And they said, "Yes." Were they not tied up? They said, "Yes." But he said, "I see 4 men in there, and they're not tied up, and they're walking in the fire, and nothing's happening to them. They're not burning, and the 4th one looks like the Son of God." Now he's going to change his tune. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and he spoke and said, listen to this. He said, first he told him who could deliver you out of my hands. Then listen to him. He said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, you servants of the Most High God, of course, come forth and come here." And they walked out of the furnace. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth in the midst of the fire. And then they called all the people together, the princes, the governors, the captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, that, listen to this, you make a stand for God, and he will make a stand for you. It said that they saw these men upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was a hair of their head singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire passed on them. You got to understand that your hair is the most volatile thing on your body. It takes a split second to burn your hair.